The other thing that changes in the second turning teachings is the emphasis that was always again there in the first turning on things like compassion, loving kindness, sympathetic joy, equanimity, these four divine abodes, these four Brahma Viharas. While that was a really important part of the early Buddhist teaching, these teachings weren't explicitly taught as a way to experience enlightenment. They could be part of it, like you could use them to develop jhana, and then you use that jhana to then investigate, and then through vipassana have insight, right? They certainly were encouraged for a lot of different reasons, but all of those reasons had to do with like relative reality. Absolute reality is only accessible through this kind of deconstructive process of noticing the three characteristics. In the early teachings, that's primarily how it's taught. In the second turning, the whole notion of compassion, karuna, is actually elevated, and it becomes equivalent. As Shinzen Young said, compassion is conceived of as on par with wisdom. Both of them are equivalently important in the second turning teachings. And you can see in a way why emptiness as interdependence would necessitate this, even just philosophically, right? You're saying everything is arising with everything else. And realizing that leads to this kind of wisdom, this wisdom of emptiness, of letting things be as they are. Then it also follows that compassion arises from this perception as well, because we see that our suffering connects us. As Trudy Goodman say, our suffering is what connects us the most as human beings. It's the shared experience that we have of satisfaction, of struggle, challenge. Like even when everything is good, there's still some feeling that there's something off. And when things are difficult and challenging, and collectively we're going through huge waves of difficulty, then it's really obvious. It's just not even that subtle. And so compassion, or you could say love, is elevated in the second turning. It's seen as is equally important. And you have all kinds of references to the two wings in the Mahayana tradition, the two wings of compassion and wisdom, that the bird of liberation must have these two together. As Joseph Goldstein, who, you could say he's mostly studied in the first turning traditions, but he clearly also is influenced by other teachers and approaches. The way he described emptiness on retreat one day, he said, emptiness is the movement of compassion is the movement of emptiness. I loved that. Compassion is the movement of emptiness, this recognition of our interdependence. When we see it, we're naturally moved to want to actually respond to suffering. We don't see suffering as like out here and over there, and I can somehow insulate myself from your suffering. No, like insulation isn't possible in interdependence. You can insulate yourself some, but the very act of insulating is also isolating. So we cause ourselves suffering when we try to remove ourselves from each other's suffering. We suffer avoiding suffering. That's part of suffering. And so the only reasonable response from the second turning perspective is to be moved by the suffering of the world, and to want to awaken to that suffering and relieve the suffering. And so here in the second turning, the real epitome of these teachings are what we could call bodhicitta, the awakened heart-mind. Chitta meaning mind or heart. And of course, there's no difference here in bodhi being the same bodhi as like Buddha, bodhi, bodhisattva, awake, the awakened heart-mind. And the idea here is that, we can sometimes will have an experience of bodhicitta, we'll be initiated into bodhicitta, perhaps by our own suffering, perhaps by suffering we witness. And suddenly we might feel, instead of being overwhelmed by that suffering or feeling like we can't handle the suffering, some part of us, some deep heart part of us can actually respond in kind, can quiver and resonate with the suffering. And we can tune into it and and not be completely enmeshed in it, but can actually hold it, like holding a crying baby, being with their tears, resonating with their suffering, knowing what it's like, because we're human, because we're alive, because we're sentient.